They threw me out of my own house after my parents died. I had nothing. But years later, I came back, not to beg, but to buy that same house.
And watch them walk out. This is the story of how betrayal built my success.
I still remember the house as if it were alive, breathing softly through the walls, holding every whisper of my childhood and every dream my parents ever had. It stood there like a quiet protector in the middle of a simple neighborhood in a small town where nothing extraordinary ever happened. Yet for me it was everything, because inside those walls my mother's laughter would echo in the mornings and my father's voice would fill the evenings with stories about hope, hard work, and honesty, and I believed every word because I had never seen a reason not to trust the world around me. But everything changed the day I lost them both in a sudden accident that tore my life apart without warning, leaving me standing in a silence so heavy that even breathing felt like a burden. I was only 19 at that time, still trying to understand life, still depending on the comfort of my parents, still believing that family meant safety and love and protection. But the moment they were gone, I realized how quickly people change when opportunity appears in the form of someone else's weakness. That was the moment my Uncle Rashid entered my life, not as a villain, at least not in the beginning, but as a man wearing kindness like a mask. He came to me with soft words and concerned eyes, placing his hand on my shoulder as if he truly cared, telling me that I was not alone anymore, that he and his family would take responsibility for me, that they would protect me and guide me. And in that moment I wanted to believe him, because I had no one else left to trust, and grief has a strange way of making lies sound like comfort. So I followed him back to the house, my house, the only place that still felt like my parents were close to me. But slowly I began to notice things that did not feel right, although at first I ignored them because I did not want to lose the only support I thought I had. My aunt started treating the house like it already belonged to her, changing things, moving furniture, giving orders to workers as if she had always lived there. And my cousins, who once barely spoke to me, suddenly acted like they owned every corner of the place, laughing loudly in rooms that once felt sacred to me. But I stayed quiet, convincing myself that maybe this was normal, that maybe this was what family support looked like after a tragedy. However, deep inside me there was a small voice whispering that something was wrong, and that voice grew louder the day my uncle called me into the living room. His expression was calm, but there was something cold hidden behind his eyes, something calculating, something that made my heart uneasy. He placed a set of papers in front of me and told me to sign them. His voice was steady, almost casual, as if he were asking me to do something simple, something routine. I looked at the papers, confused, asking him what they were, but instead of giving a clear answer, he smiled faintly and said they were just formalities for property management, that everything was for my own good, that it would protect me from legal complications. And at that moment I felt trapped between doubt and trust, because on one side I wanted to question him, to read every word, to understand what I was signing, but on the other side I feared that questioning him would make me seem ungrateful or suspicious, and I did not want to lose the only family I thought I had left. So I hesitated, holding the pen in my trembling hand, my mind filled with uncertainty and fear. And when I said I wanted to read the documents, first, the atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The warmth disappeared, replaced by tension. My aunt's face hardened and her voice cut through the silence as she accused me of not trusting them, of being ungrateful after everything they were doing for me. And my uncle's eyes darkened as he leaned back in his chair, watching me with a look that made me feel small and powerless, as if I had no right to question anything at all. The pressure built around me, like invisible walls closing and making it difficult to breathe. And in that moment I made the biggest mistake of my life. I signed the papers without fully understanding them, without realizing that with each stroke of the pen I was giving away not just a house, but the last piece of my parents that I had left. That night I could not sleep. Something felt wrong deep in my chest, but I tried to ignore it, telling myself that everything would be fine, that my uncle would never betray me because he was family. But a week later reality came crashing down on me in the harshest way possible. I returned home after a long day, only to find my suitcase thrown outside the door, lying on the ground like it meant nothing, like I meant nothing. My heart started racing as I pushed the door open, only to be stopped by my uncle standing in front of me, his expression no longer kind, no longer pretending. He told me coldly that I had no right to enter, that the house belonged to him now, and his words felt like a knife cutting through everything I believed in. I tried to speak, tried to understand what was happening, but he showed me the signed documents, the ones I had trusted him with, and in that moment everything became clear. I had been deceived, manipulated, used by the very people I thought would protect me. My voice broke as I asked him why he would do this to me, and instead of guilt or regret, my aunt simply smiled, a cruel smile that I will never forget, as she told me that this was a lesson in life, that I should never trust anyone, especially family. Those words echoed in my mind as I stood there frozen, unable to process the betrayal, unable to accept that I had lost everything, not just my parents, but my home, my safety, my sense of belonging. And as they closed the door on me, shutting me out of the place that once held all my memories, I felt something inside me break completely, leaving behind a hollow emptiness that no words could describe. And as I stood there alone on the street with nowhere to go, I realized that the world I believed in, the world where family meant love and protection, was nothing more than an illusion. And that night, as the darkness surrounded me, I took my first step into a life I never imagined, a life built not on trust but on survival, not on love but on pain. And deep inside that broken version of myself, a quiet realization began to form that this was not the end of my story, but the beginning of something much darker, something that would one day turn into strength. But at that moment, all I felt was lost, betrayal, and a silence so heavy that it felt like it would swallow me whole. That night, after being thrown out of the only home I had ever known, I sat alone on a cold wooden bench under a dim streetlight with my small bag beside me, and a heart so heavy that it felt like it would collapse inside my chest, because just a few days ago I still believed that even after losing my parents I had family left, people who would stand beside me in my weakest moment. But now that illusion had shattered completely, leaving me with nothing but silence and the harsh reality that I was truly on my own in a world that suddenly felt too big, too cruel, and too indifferent to care whether I survived or disappeared. And as the night grew darker, the wind became colder, yet strangely it felt kinder than the voices of my own relatives, because at least the wind did not lie to me, it did not pretend to love me before pushing me away. And I remember staring at the empty road in front of me, wondering how my life had fallen apart so quickly, how a place filled with warmth and memories had turned into a symbol of betrayal and loss. And in that moment I realized that grief was no longer just about losing my parents. It had become something deeper, something more painful, because now I had lost trust, one had lost security, and I had lost the belief that someone would come to save me. And so I made a quiet decision that night. Without speaking a single word to anyone, I told myself that if no one was coming to help me, then I would have to become my own support, my own strength, my own reason to keep going, even if it meant walking a path filled with struggle and loneliness. And the next few weeks became a test of endurance unlike anything I had ever experienced before. I moved from one place to another, searching for small jobs that would at least give me enough money to eat something each day. Sometimes I worked at a roadside tea stall, washing cups and serving customers who barely noticed my existence, while other days I carried heavy loads for shopkeepers just to earn a few coins. And there were moments when hunger felt like a constant companion, a silent ache that never fully disappeared, because I often chose to save money instead of spending it on food, telling myself that survival required sacrifice and that every small step mattered, even if it felt insignificant at the time. And at night, when the city grew quiet, I would sit under streetlights with borrowed books, trying to continue my education, because deep inside me there was still a part that refused to give up on the dreams my parents once had for me, a part that believed that knowledge could be my way out of this darkness. And I remember how people would look at me with either pity or indifference. Some would laugh quietly seeing a boy in worn-out clothes trying to study, as if it were a pointless effort, as if someone like me had no future worth fighting for. And those moments hurt more than I can describe, because it is one thing to struggle and another to feel invisible in the eyes of the world. Yet instead of breaking me, those experiences slowly began to shape me into someone stronger, someone who understood that respect is not given freely, it is earned through persistence and resilience. And during those long nights when exhaustion tried to pull me down, I would close my eyes and see the image of that door being shut on my face, hear the words that I had no right to my own home, feel the weight of betrayal pressing against my chest. And instead of letting that pain destroy me, I started using it as fuel, telling myself again and again that one day I would rise above all of this, not for revenge alone, but to prove that I was not as weak as they believed. I was not someone who could be erased so easily. And as time passed, opportunities slowly began to appear, small at first but meaningful. I applied for scholarships with determination, pouring every bit of effort into my studies, because I knew that education was my only chance to change my circumstances. And after countless rejections and moments of doubt, I finally received one acceptance letter that changed everything. It was not just a piece of paper, it was a doorway, a chance to leave behind the streets that had witnessed my struggles and step into a future that still felt uncertain but hopeful. And moving to another city was both exciting and terrifying, because I had no support system, no familiar faces, only a burning desire to succeed. And in that new environment, I pushed myself harder than ever before, balancing studies with part-time jobs, working long hours, often up to 16 hours a day just to cover my expenses. And there were days when my Body felt too tired to continue when sleep seemed more important than ambition, but every time I felt like giving up, I remembered why I started. I remembered the pain of being abandoned and the promise I made to myself on that cold night, and that memory gave me the strength to keep moving forward step by step even when progress felt slow and uncertain. And over the years, I began to notice changes not just in my circumstances, but within myself. I became more disciplined, more focused, more aware of the realities of life. I learned how to manage money, how to communicate with people, how to navigate challenges without losing sight of my goals, and eventually my hard work started to pay off. I graduated with top honors, achieving something that once seemed impossible for someone in my position, and that achievement opened new doors, leading me to a job in a real estate company where for the first time I experienced stability, a steady income, a sense of direction, and although it was not the final destination, it was a significant milestone in my journey, and from there I continued to grow, moving to better opportunities, gaining experience, learning the intricacies of business, understanding how properties were bought and sold, how decisions were made, and how power often rested in the hands of those who understood the system. And with each passing year my confidence increased, and the boy who once sat on a bench with nothing slowly transformed into a man who knew his worth, who understood his potential, and who refused to be defined by his past. And eventually I took the biggest step of all. I started my own business, a decision filled with risk, uncertainty, and fear, but also hope, because it represented true independence, the ability to create something of my own without relying on anyone else. And the journey was far from easy. There were failures, setbacks, moments when everything seemed to fall apart, and I questioned whether I had made the right choice. But unlike before, I no longer saw failure as the end. Instead, I treated it as a lesson, an opportunity to learn, adapt, and grow stronger. And through persistence, determination, and an unshakable belief in myself, I slowly built something meaningful, something that reflected not just success but resilience. And throughout this entire journey, one thought remained constant in my mind, like a quiet flame that never went out: the memory of that house, the place that once symbolized everything I had lost. And although I rarely spoke about it to others, it continued to drive me, pushing me to achieve more, to become better, to reach a point where I would never again be at the mercy of someone else's greed. And by the time several years had passed, I found myself standing in a position I once thought was impossible: financially stable, professionally successful, and emotionally stronger than ever before. And yet, despite all these achievements, I knew that my journey was not complete, because there was still a part of my story that needed closure, a chapter that had begun with betrayal and pain and now awaited its conclusion. And as I looked back on everything I had endured, I realized that those difficult years were not just about survival, they were about transformation. They were about turning weakness into strength, turning loss into motivation, and turning a broken past into a foundation for a powerful future. And in that realization, I found a sense of peace, not because the pain had disappeared, but because it had been given meaning, a purpose that guided me toward the life I was building step by step, day by day, until the moment would come when I would finally return, not as the boy who was cast aside, but as the man who had risen above it all, ready to face the past with confidence and reclaim what was once taken from him, not out of anger, but out of the quiet understanding that true victory lies not in destroying others, but in proving to yourself that you were always capable of becoming something greater than the pain you endured. After 8 long years of struggle, sacrifice, and silent determination, I finally returned to the place that once broke me, not as the same helpless boy who had stood outside with tears in his eyes, but as a man shaped by hardship, strengthened by failure, and driven by a purpose that had never faded with time. And as my car slowly entered the familiar street, every memory came rushing back with a force that made my chest feel tight, because every corner, every wall, every shadow carried a piece of my past, a reminder of what I had lost and what I had survived. And when I finally stepped out and stood across from the house, I felt time pause for a moment, as if the world itself wanted me to absorb the weight of that scene, because there was the same house that once echoed with laughter, now standing quiet and worn, as if it too had suffered in my absence. And I could not help but notice how different it looked, not because the structure had changed, but because I had changed. The house that once felt grand and full of life now appeared smaller, weaker, almost fragile, and I realized that the power it once held over me had disappeared, because the boy who gave it meaning was no longer broken. And as I stood there watching silently, I felt no anger, no overwhelming rage, only a deep calmness that surprised even me, because I had imagined this moment many times in my mind. I had thought I would feel victorious or emotional or even vengeful, but instead there was only clarity, a quiet understanding that this was not about proving something to others, but about closing a chapter that had remained open for far too long. And after a few moments, I turned away and walked toward a nearby property office, my steps steady, my mind focused because I already knew what I needed to do, and as I entered the office the agent greeted me politely, unaware of the storm of memories behind my calm expression, and I asked him a simple question about the house across the street, and when he checked his records and looked back at me with a slightly surprised expression, he told me that the property was indeed up for sale, that the current owners were facing heavy financial problems and were desperate to sell it quickly. And hearing those words felt like the universe had aligned everything in a way that I could not ignore, because the very people who once took everything from me were now standing on the edge of losing it all themselves, and in that moment I did not feel satisfaction or joy at their situation. Instead, I felt a strange sense of balance, as if life had quietly corrected something that had once been unfair, and without hesitation, without second thoughts, I told the agent that I would buy the house, and he seemed impressed by my decisiveness. But for me it was not a business decision, it was something deeper, something personal, something that had been years in the making, and over the next few days the process moved quickly. As the sun began to set on that unforgettable day, I stood quietly in front of the house watching my uncle and his family walk out through the same gate with bags in their hands and heavy regret in their eyes, and there was a strange stillness in the air, as if even time had slowed down to witness the completion of a story that had begun many years ago with pain and betrayal. And as I looked at them, I did not see powerful people anymore. I did not see the ones who once controlled everything and treated me like I was nothing. Instead, I saw broken individuals weighed down by their own choices, and for a brief moment our eyes met, and in that silence there was an unspoken understanding of everything that had happened between us, the past, the deception, the suffering, and the long journey that had led us to this exact point. And yet, despite all of it, I felt no desire to humiliate them, no urge to shout or remind them of how cruel they had been, because somewhere along my journey I had learned that true strength is not about revenge through pain, but about rising above the need to hurt others. And as they slowly stepped out onto the street, I was reminded of myself from years ago, standing in the same position with nowhere to go, and although their situation was the result of their own actions, I still felt a quiet sense of empathy, not because they deserved forgiveness easily, but because I understood what it meant to lose everything. And as the gate closed behind them, marking the end of their time in that house, I took a deep breath and walked inside once again, but this time the feeling was completely different, because I was no longer entering as someone who belonged there by birth. I was entering as someone who had earned the right to be there through years of struggle, persistence, and unwavering determination. And as I stepped into the living room, memories surrounded me like echoes from another life. I could almost hear my mother calling my name, feel the warmth of my father's presence, and for a moment my eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of a deep emotional release, because after everything I had been through, I had finally come back, not to reclaim the past, but to make peace with it. And I slowly walked through each room, touching the walls, running my fingers over surfaces that once held pieces of my childhood, and with every step I felt a sense of closure growing stronger inside me, as if the house itself was welcoming me back, not as a lost child, but as someone who had completed a long and difficult journey. And in that moment I realized something important, that revenge is often misunderstood, because people think it is about making others suffer the way you suffered, but in reality the sweetest form of revenge is building a life so strong, so meaningful, that the past no longer has the power to control you. And with that realization came a decision that changed everything, because although I had the opportunity to keep the house for myself, to live in it and enjoy the success I had achieved, I chose a different path, one that reflected the lessons I had learned through my pain. And instead of holding on to the house as a symbol of victory, I decided to transform it into something greater, something that could bring hope to others who were once in the same position I had been in. And over the following weeks I began renovating the entire place, repairing the broken parts, strengthening the structure, and redesigning the interior, not just to make it beautiful, but to make it meaningful. And during this process I often found myself reflecting on my journey, thinking about the nights I had spent alone, the struggles I had faced, and the strength I had built along the way. And with each passing day the house slowly turned into something new, something filled with purpose. And when the renovation was finally complete, I opened its doors not for myself, but for children who had no home, no family, and no one to rely on, because I knew exactly how it felt to be abandoned, to be left without support. And I wanted to create a space where no child would ever feel that same emptiness again. And at the entrance I placed a simple board with words that came straight from my heart, a reminder of everything I had learned, that a home is not taken, it is built with love. And as the first group of children walked in, their eyes filled with curiosity and hope, I felt a deep sense of fulfillment that no amount of money or success could ever replace, because in that moment I understood that my journey was never just about revenge, it was about transformation, about turning pain into purpose and using my experiences to create something positive for others. And days later, as life began to settle into a new rhythm, I found myself standing near the gate one evening when I noticed a familiar figure approaching slowly, hesitantly, and as he came closer I recognized my uncle, his posture weaker, his face filled with regret, and for a moment neither of us spoke, because sometimes silence carries more meaning than words ever could. And finally he looked at me with eyes that once held authority but now only reflected guilt, and he whispered an apology, simple yet heavy with emotion. And as I listened I felt a mixture of feelings rise within me, memories of the past, the pain of betrayal, and the strength I had gained through it all. And after a long pause I responded calmly, telling him that I forgave him, but I would never forget, because forgiveness is not about erasing the past, it is about freeing yourself from its control. And as he nodded, slowly accepting my words, I realized that this was the final step in my journey, not the moment I bought the house, not the moment they left, but this quiet exchange where I chose peace over anger and growth over resentment. And as he turned and walked away, I felt a sense of closure unlike anything I had ever experienced before, because the story that had once begun with loss had now ended with strength and purpose. And as I looked around at the house now filled with laughter, once again I understood that I had not just reclaimed a building, I had rebuilt my life, my identity, and my future. And in doing so I had proven something far more powerful than revenge, that even the deepest betrayal can become the foundation for something beautiful if you have the courage to rise above it, and that sometimes the boy who was once thrown out into the darkness can return, not just to take back what was lost, but to create a light that shines for others, guiding them toward a better tomorrow. And in that realization I finally felt complete, not because the past had changed, but because I had, and that was more than enough to make everything worthwhile.